Standing out is getting harder and harder these days. And the reason is, our solutions are so much more complicated. It's interesting for me to see all the commercials that are, the cloud this, Microsoft Cloud, IBM Cloud, all of these cloud solutions, and the opportunities are endless, but yet there's not enough time to explain what those solutions are. So it's getting really complicated. And at the same time, attention spans are shrinking. Is this mic working okay, or is it better without? Okay, better with. So attention spans are shrinking. I like to say we're in like the 140 character or less attention span zone. And one of my pet peeves is going to a website and just seeing paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of copy and thinking, do they really think that anyone's going to read that? Because they don't. And then on a bit of another topic, PR is getting harder and harder for startups. And I'm going to address this a little bit later, but this has changed dramatically since Shivati mentioned that I was working for this startup in Pocket that we ultimately sold to Nokia. 10 years ago, you could put out a press release and about the latest version of your platform, and TechCrunch would cover it. And today, that's not the case at all. It's really, really hard to get someone to cover your company in the tech space. And I think my interpretation of what's happened is I think that a lot of these journalists have been burned so much, have been bamboozled so much by startups that don't necessarily tell them the straight story and don't have any accountability that the public companies have, so they focus their time and attention on Google, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all these larger companies. And a lot of the journalists say it right in their byline. They're like, these are the companies I cover. So that makes it a lot trickier for small companies to get earned media. So in order to really rise above the noise, you have to start with a little company soul searching. So what I do with my clients is I start with about a 2-hour, almost like a therapy session. I ask a lot of questions around a lot of topics to really help extract what it is that makes this company unique. And most people that start a company do it because they found a way to do something better. And the problem is that most people have a hard time explaining that story. So I'm not going to go through every question that I go through in this interview, because we'd be here all night. But I want to talk about some of the big ones that are helpful in really shaping the messaging and positioning for a company. So every company starts out, I think, by thinking, well, what is it that we stand for? And and then they all start to come up with the same things. Like, we stand for innovation, we stand for growth, we stand for transparency and trust. Okay? And then we all start to sound alike. But one of the questions that I think is more important than what do we stand for is, what does this company stand against? And yeah, so just to tease this out a little bit, what is your biggest complaint about your industry? What is it that everybody's doing wrong? Really get mad. What is it? What makes you mad? Why did you go out and start a company to solve these problems? And what can you do better? What is it that needs to be fixed? And what is it that you're doing to fix that? And then what problem are you solving? And what is the benefit of working with you or with your company specifically? So the answers to these questions start to lay the groundwork for your positioning and your messaging. Okay, next one. And this is where it gets really hard. So now, how do you answer those questions, but without using a load of jargon and buzzwords? And I know that jargons and buzzwords are on a continuum for everyone. And I don't know, someone you may say, I don't know how I could ever describe my solution without using the word framework or end-to-end. So for me, the buzzwords that I don't like are the ones that are absolutely meaningless, like, we take this to the next level. But I'm sure everybody has their favorite. So once you've done that, once you've figured out what you stand for, then it's really about carving out your unique point of view. And this becomes important with respect to getting covered in the media, creating messaging that is memorable and shareable. And the other thing that I would say is don't be afraid to be controversial. So this was an example of a little ad that I saw from a branding agency that I thought, well, this is kind of cool. This is boring people make boring brands that die. And I thought, it's controversial. You can tell that they know what they stand against, this company that created this ad. And then I also thought it was kind of clever the way they made it really kind of a boring box with black type, but it does drive the point home. Okay, the other thing too is the fun part about being on the cutting edge of technology is that you can coin terms and you can own them and you can own a narrative. And I wanted to give an example of a client that I worked with where we did just this. So, okay, who's used Snapchat? All right. Okay, so I was afraid of this. Snapchat. Okay, who said they were doing augmented reality? Come on. Okay. So. We do now. Okay. All right. Well, go with me on this. So Snapchat, all the kids are doing it. You take a selfie and there's some kind of filter and then they share it with their friends. Well, what's happening is now brands are getting on board. So advertisers like, this is a Taco Bell ad. So Taco Bell paid, I can't remember, it was like $1 million to own one of the filters on one day. And people could take a picture of themselves and overlay this big taco shell. And then the kids could send it to all their friends. And it got shared like 750,000 times on the first day. So I was working with a company based in Boston called Vivoom. And they're kind of the Snapchat for brands. So these augmented reality filters that, people could interact with the brand, co-create a visual experience, and then share it with their friends. But nobody was doing this, and nobody knew what to call it. So they were calling it user-generated marketing. And it was just a little bit wonky and hard to explain. So after kind of going through some of the questioning and the process I was talking about before, what we did was we wanted a platform for thought leadership. So like, let's coin a new term. So paid media, when you go out and buy an advertisement, when you buy somebody's audience, if you put an ad on Facebook, you're paying to access those eyeballs. That's what the industry considers paid media. And then if you get covered in the media for free because you get good PR, you've created a really cool viral ad that gets sent around and shared, that's called earned media. So we decided, well, why don't we create a whole new category for this? Let's call it shared media. And then, we can start writing byline articles and educating people about shared media. And so that's what this company did. So Vivoom, they're a shared media marketing company. And, we've been placing articles in Adweek and Media Week, really educating marketers. You need to learn about shared media. This is what it's all about. I tried to get them to change the name of their company from Vivoom to something around shared media so they could really, really own the space. Not only own the narrative, but own the whole space by rebranding their company. They didn't want to spend the money. All right, so the next topic that I want to talk about is narrowing your focus and stop trying to sell to everyone. And this is a trap that a lot of us get stuck in because you don't want to turn away any business. So one of the lines of questioning that I do as part of my brand therapy session is to get clients to think about who is your ideal client. And this isn't really arbitrary. This isn't envision your ideal client. It's really based on your past experience. So who's been the most profitable? Who've been the easiest to work with, the best to work with? And then to really tease it out again. And so for me, just to give you an example, so for me, I was kind of doing stuff for everybody. And then I realized, well, really my most profitable clients are companies that are in the tech space, that are just coming out of stealth mode. They've probably got typos on their website. They want to polish their marketing. They can't afford to bring in a CMO, but they need senior level help, maybe for a month, maybe for a project, maybe because they're trying to get funding, maybe they're starting to get traction because they've got some big customers, but that's kind of the sweet spot. And so that's what I begin to focus my services on. So we talked about that. And then getting really clear on who that persona, or who that customers will help you when it comes time to figuring out your own branding, and whether it's your messaging, your look and feel, your tone of voice, the content, where you might, what are those people reading? How do you reach those people? And it also helps you to position yourself as an expert. And I wanted to bring this to life a little bit with an example. So let's say you've got Web Developer 1 and Web Developer 2, and they both are very speedy, they have high quality work, they're very efficient and trustworthy. But Web Developer 2 started working with real estate agents and started building a specialty in that area. So now what she can do as a specialty web developer for the real estate market is she can really fine-tune her offering. She knows what that client needs. She can build templates. Unlike, say, a hairdresser or a builder, they're going to come back to her because, they've got a new house on the market and they need a slideshow, so it's repeat business. They can pay her bill. She can do it faster and she can charge a premium. She can also get referrals from within that industry, and she can start, again, to position herself as an expert and create content in that area. Another example, I helped launch a healthy food company up in Truckee last year called Therapeutic Chef. And we created the brand, and then it came time to create our product labels. And one thing we didn't realize is that with a food product, there are all kinds of regulations about the product label. All kinds of things you have to say, where it needs to be, on the front, on the back, what the font size is, where does the barcode go, all kinds of stuff. And our regular designer that created our brand didn't know any of this stuff. So we had to dig deep, but we did find somebody that did just this and was a graphic designer especially for food labeling. We paid him a much higher hourly rate, but he did it a lot faster. Okay, I want to talk a little about naming a company. This is kind of a fun topic. Or horrible, depending on how you approach those things. So the thing with naming is there is no silver bullet when it comes to choosing a name, and you will ultimately, create a brand around that word or words. But even if you do choose an awesome name, there's no guarantees of success if you do, right? Uber has had an interesting few weeks. I won't go into that, but. But the best names are easy to pronounce, easy to spell, and easy to remember. I would recommend against choosing a very descriptive name like Quality Lawn Care, Tahoe Builders, things like that. Something very generic. It's difficult to remember. It's bad for search engine optimization. And ultimately, you're going to spend more time in advertising trying to build up brand recognition because it's so generic. And similarly, like in the tech world, what do we see a lot? Integrated systems. I actually think this was a company that may have sold for a lot of money. I heard it on a podcast the other day, but cloud computing systems, I mean, we can think of 1,000 of these, right? And same kind of thing. They're hard to remember. They're too generic. They're boring, boring, boring. Acronyms. I hate acronyms, and not only for company names, but for product names, right? Because everybody's got the cloud computing platform that always turns into the CCP, which means nothing to except for the one person or the group of people that know what CPP stands for. But one company that I worked for, I joined, is called W3I. And they were pivoting into mobile game monetization, so putting ads in games. And this was in 2012, I joined them. And this was right around the time when in the mobile advertising space, or in digital advertising in general, things were shifting into native ads. So no longer just these banners, these standalone banners, but instead creating ad formats that were integrated into the user experience of the app. And so the ads that this company was doing were just that. They were incentivized game ads that were part of the gaming experience. And it was really, really early days and people talking about native. So this was kind of a gamble, but we named the company NativeX. And let's see if I added this here. No, I didn't. I'll talk about it. But we named it NativeX instead of W3I because W3I stood for nothing. NativeX, people could relate to immediately. And it was, like I said, it was a bit of a gamble because if native would have been one of these technologies that kind of came and went, we might have been, not so lucky, but also we knew that we were going to build this brand into whatever it was going to be anyway. So you look at things like Apple, Pandora, things that might have meant something else. That company is going to build that brand into its own entity. Okay, so other pet peeves of mine with brand naming are anything that you cannot pronounce or people can't pronounce or spell. So who knows how to, I guess there's commercial now, so does everyone know how to pronounce this yogurt brand? Faye. And then SV, I don't even know how to pronounce SVBTLE. But when you have a complicated name like that, people are less likely to talk about you, less likely to find you. And I just read a research stat that less likely to invest in your company. Some other naming strategies that I think work well are taking a name that is associated with what you're doing and pairing it with a name that is completely unrelated to what you're doing. So MailChimp is one example, and then there's a company doing mobile analytics down in the city called Lean Plum. And then we've also seen blended words. So Pinterest is pin plus interest, and Shopify, and those are quite memorable too. Okay, so NativeX, I talked about that before. So jumping on a trend that is very timely. Deep learning is also, for anyone kind of in the analytics space, deep learning. So DeepMind is one of the new startups on the scene in deep learning. And then when it comes to, I'm not a graphic designer, but when it comes to branding and creating a logo, I like to say work backwards from the sticker. And this is a brand that I love. It's actually a nonprofit called Send It, and it's for cancer fighters. They create outdoor experiences for cancer fighters to kind of pull them out of the day in and day out of chemotherapy and things like that. That's such an awesome logo. And you see their stickers everywhere, at least up in Tahoe, I see them all the time. And if you've got a great brand and a great logo, people will do your advertising for you. So there was a new company that just started up in Tahoe, a skydiving company. And I just thought, and they went with a very generic name, like Tahoe Truckee Skydive. And the logo is really kind of busy and PowerPoint clip art. And I was like, wow, that company really had this exact same opportunity. If they called it something super cool like Jump and had a really cool logo, people would plaster that on everything because they want to be associated with that, with something cool, and especially in the extreme sports world. When and when not to name your company after yourself. So when is if it helps you in a Google search. If you are the face of the company, if you want your ideas and approaches to be known as yours, you're the Tony Robbins of whatever your company is. That would be an example of that. When not to name your company after yourself, you don't want to be highly visible. You want to appear larger than what you are. So maybe your clients would feel more comfortable working with a firm than with an individual. Or you plan to build a bigger company.
Or sell it.
Or sell it, exactly. Okay, so a little bit about brand personality. Every brand is going to have a personality, regardless of whether they deliberately define it or not. So I'm sure, I come from a very right brain, I am very right brain. I think a lot of you in this room are very left brain. So this may be not an exciting exercise, but I've gone through it with a couple of companies before where we've really had to like define, you know, who are we as a company? Like, what famous actress would we be? What kind of car would we drive? What shoes would we wear? What do we look like? And it's an important exercise because if you don't, then again, you really do start to sound, it's harder to create something a little bit more unique, to have more of a unique perspective. Without intention or thought, you'll end up looking very generic and me too, or even worse. But that may be okay. But if you are trying to blaze new trails, then it is important, I think, to go through this persona. Who are we going to be? Who are we talking to? And this kind of leads back to, you know, who our target is, who that ideal customer is. And it may also lead back to what is the prevailing personality in your industry. So what I talked about before, what do you stand against? So again, for me, I don't like a lot of business jargon. I don't like the boring blah, 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 the same old, same old, same old. So yeah, I try to take a little bit of a more different tone of voice and avoid using those words like compelling and leverage, things like that. Synergy, yeah. End to end. All right. Yeah, so we talked about that. So how would that be reflected in what you say, how you say it, and what you do? I was just reading a book, and there is a company of a startup of people that have worked in the financial services industry, and they were targeting millennials and want to do financial planning for millennials. And they went with, you know, they'd come from like Morgan Stanley or something. So for them, this was a huge departure, but they were, you know, very, very kind of aggressive in their branding. And you had words like, you know, on their website, like, let's get your financial shit together, which you would never see on a Morgan Stanley website, but that wasn't their audience. They weren't going after 50-year-old financial planners. They were going after millennials. And so that worked for them. Okay, so some action steps. These are some things that you could do right away to improve your branding and messaging. And the first thing most companies can do is erase about half the copy on their homepage and replace it with about 4 awesome sentences that describe, you know, why you're so great and why you're different. And that's where this idea of killing the jargon comes in, because every word is precious. And so you don't have a lot of space and time for a lot of the blah, blah, blah that everybody else is saying. And then the other thing I always do is run it by your mom or your dad or, you know, somebody who's outside of your industry. Because, you know, if your mom can't understand it, then there are probably different audiences that aren't going to be able to understand it either. And you're not just talking to one audience. I mean, you're also talking to possibly potential investors or journalists or other people that are coming to your website. So I think it's important to make sure that you pass the mom test, at least for part of it. And then, to circle back to this idea of PR, I do think that there is an option, a really good opportunity to become a thought leader, especially if you're a good writer, if you like to write. And there are a couple of ways of doing this, right? You can publish articles on your own LinkedIn or Medium, but you can also publish bylines in industry publications. And generally the difference is that if you are getting published like under a different publisher, not just your own LinkedIn or Medium, a lot of times they don't want you doing a lot of self-promotion. So you have to have a little bit more of a clever strategy in terms of getting your point across without really coming across as somebody who's really trying to shill their services or their company. But if you've got a unique perspective, I'll use the example of a guy that started a company called Sharethrough back in, again, 2012. And this was, his name was Dan Greenberg, based in San Francisco. And he was the first guy that was talking about native advertising. And because he had such a unique story and a unique perspective, he was writing articles in Huffington Post, in Media Post, in Adweek, and in all kinds of things because his story was so fresh. And he didn't need to give a huge company pitch because people were interested in what he had to say and tying it back to the company. And I wanted to end with, I just saw some research recently on the things that make a good brand. And there was this kind of common theme about representing something just a little bit bigger. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this. So this was from a company called We Are Social. Number one, a great brand's value proposition extends beyond its products. And the example that they gave was Red Bull, because Red Bull challenges people's concept of what is humanly possible. Think about their marketing activities and think, sponsorships around extreme sports. That kind of thing has very little to do with a very sugary, caffeinated beverage, right? It's more about you're buying into a lifestyle. Another thing that makes a great brand is that they don't interrupt people, they involve them. And so the example here was Nike. And Nike, not only with the large runs that they put on, but they do community running groups and things like that to really foster brand love. And then thirdly, great brands aren't just differentiated, they make a difference. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because I think this is important right now and in our industry in particular. So one example would be companies like Tom's Shoes, where you buy a pair of shoes and he gives back. But where this, I think, resonates in the tech world is, we are right now, technology is coming at us so fast and furiously, and it comes with some baggage. So things like artificial intelligence that has the potential to, to displace workers, to impinge on people's privacy. So it's more and more important that companies that are deploying these technologies are doing it in a very conscious way, and think about that before introducing technology like that. And I use the example of Salesforce here because this is a company that I think is incredibly conscious. And they've built sort of this value system into the DNA of the company so that when it does come to, a situation like last week when we pull out of the Paris Agreement, that was part of their DNA to stand up and protest that. So it's something to think about early on if you are trying to build a bigger company. What types of value system are you going to build into your DNA, and how will you live those values going forward? And I think that's it. Any? Questions? Hi. Or do you want to say it and I'll just repeat it?
How do you set expectations for the success of the partnership in hiring you and working with the company, whether it's startup or enterprise?
How do you set expectations for success? Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you, I don't know how you set the expectations, but there are certain factors that lend to a more successful interaction. And one is with respect to branding and positioning. If you're working with a huge group of people, it's really, really hard to get to consensus, and that tends to kind of dilute your messaging and your branding. If I can only work with one or two people, and we can push the envelope without having to appease a larger group, that's helpful. And then, sometimes there are people that are just really, really attached to what they're doing. And let's say you're a product a product manager and you think that it's really important that every single aspect of the product is out on the website for your customers to read, that can be tricky, and that's a negotiation for me to really get them to realize that people aren't going to read all that copy. So I guess it kind of depends on each example.
I've got a follow-up.
Okay.
What about reporting? A lot of clients say, well, okay, what kind of documentation can I see and how often can I see it?
What about reporting? So reporting, it depends on what I'm doing. Brand measurement is really tricky. So for you, like you're doing social media, so you can report on, how many new followers we got or how many retweets or things like that. So some things that are really easy to quantify. With PR, how much readership did we get for this article that we posted? But with respect to brand, when we change the name of a company or create a new logo or something like that, that is really, really hard to measure. And I have this weird litmus test. And this is messaging and positioning and everything all together. And it kind of goes like this. So if our outsides are better than our insides, then we know we're doing a good job with branding. So meaning, if people perceive this company to be much more successful than we actually are, or people think our product is much better than it actually is, if we're really a disaster on the inside, but nobody knows that, and there's this perception that we're doing great, then our branding is working. And there are a lot of companies where it's the opposite, where they actually have a really solid, amazing product and not much brand recognition. So it just really depends on what aspect of marketing. But branding is really, really hard to measure.
You mentioned being a company being in stealth mode and then transitioning out of that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as a criteria that you should stay in stealth mode, and what are the criteria when you should come out of stealth mode?
When should you stay in stealth mode, and when should you come out of stealth mode? Oh, good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Like if you're trying to get money, a lot of it probably comes down to the product and the state of the product, because you don't want to launch a product before it's ready. Or it depends on the sales cycle too. But if you go to market too quickly with a product that's not ready, then you're either going to create a negative experience, which will negatively impact your brand. Does that help?
That's basically the approach I'm taking. We're staying in stealth mode for a while, yes.
Yeah.
I heard somebody like you to be a little further along.
Yeah.
Would you discuss the value between imagery and textual description,
Yeah.
especially when you have people who are left and right brain,
Yeah.
who one's pushing one and one's pushing the other?
I love this question. I think it's super important that imagery versus text, they work together. They are so important. Imagery is such an important part of telling a story. If I'm getting your question right, with respect to branding, and it's very subtle and it's very subliminal too. So I'm, as you can see, I am not a graphic designer. I don't have that skill, but I know what I like, and I did not work obviously with a designer on this, but when I've created brands, I've worked with a designer, and creating I guess I call it a creative brief for the designer with respect to designing the imagery goes straight back to all the things I talked about. What tone do we want to create? Is it whimsical? Is it techie? Do we want this company to look like, really, really boxy and, gears and tech and going after like a real technical audience? Or are we maybe going after game developers and we want it to be a little more fun, a little more animated, a little more illustrated? So I think they go hand in hand. And I think that the person that understands the branding has to be giving direction to the designer. Hi.
A key challenge that a lot of technology companies have is not getting started selling to the early adopters. If you've got a good product and it suits what they're looking for, is relatively easy. It's selling to the early majority. There tends to be a large chasm between the early adopters' wants and needs and the early majority wants and needs, and a lot of companies fail into that chasm. Do you have any thoughts around crossing that chasm and how to get from your startup mode, early adopter sales mode into that early majority, which is where the profitability lives?
Do you mean in terms of the positioning of the solution, or?
Exactly. In terms
Yeah.
of positioning of the solution and recognizing it's a build on what you said at the beginning
Yeah.
about focus
Yeah.
and not trying to be all things for all people.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, hey, you can always reinvent if you need. So, you know, it can be trial and error. And if messaging isn't working, or if you're not attracting the right clientele, then you can always change it. Because if you're really, really focused on the right audience target, they're going to self-identify. And a lot of times, they'll self-identify if you're really zeroed in on who that person is. Yeah.
I kind of have the reverse question.
Okay.
I find that you know, a lot of branding is kind of mixed up with more mass marketing, and a lot of small companies are focused too much on this mass marketing or branding idea when they should be focused more on customer acquisition and getting those first customers making sales. And putting a lot of money into very ineffective marketing. Do you have
Yeah.
any strategies? Or
Yeah, no, sometimes. I mean, I think the most successful companies do exactly what you're doing. You know, build some momentum, build some traction, learn from those customers. Yeah, and then, you know, before you spend the money, get it figured out. You know, trial and error.
particularly startups think they can solve the problem by throwing some money at it on the mass marketing side?
Not the startups I work with. Hi.
So I got a question and a comment.
Mm-hmm.
The question is location-based brands. I noticed a company here recently noticed that there was no Grass Valley plumbing, so they said, "Oh, I'm going to take that," and they were immensely successful right away. So if there's something like that, some low-hanging fruit sitting around, do you think that's a good idea? And I also would mention the Grass Valley Group, which is a tech company that started much of the tech in this industry or in this area. So they obviously use a location as a brand. And then the comment is, you mentioned that that acronyms are not so great,
Yeah.
but I would say that an acronym can cross a Rubicon of some kind. So if you became Covfefe Industries, you might actually do pretty well.
Is that an acronym, Covfefe?
It is actually, there's somebody in the Congress.
Only a
came
few
up with
people,
an
though.
act today.
Oh,
They're called the Covfefe Act, which
Yeah.
is about making tweets.
I did see that. I saw that. Yeah. So acronyms, yeah. I mean, there are some successful companies that are acronyms, IBM, HP. You know, you ultimately do, I think, have to spend a lot of money in order to build that recognition, in order to own that. And then also, you know, the URLs are all gone and things like that. So local marketing, you know, in Tahoe, I would steer everybody away from Sierra this, Alpine that, Tahoe that. You know what I mean? Just that's my approach. But.
The Grass Valley.
We went through that with the Medicaid Tech Connection. We had a real hard time figuring out, because Sierra kept popping up.
Yeah.
And we're like,
Yeah,
Sierra and mountains.
yeah,
Too
mountain,
many
yeah.
mountains. And wine glasses. Too many mountains, too many wine glasses.
Hi.
Do you have any advice for a very generically named company? For example, a company around is called Blue, and we do a lot of like very creative visual things with them. But I wonder if you have any insights and experience with generically named.
It's called Blue.
Like flower.
Oh, Bloom. I like simple names like that. I really like names like that. They're memorable. You know, yeah, you have some search engine issues trying to, you know, get people to your specific Bloom. But, you know, if you have if your visual look and feel is really distinct, I don't have any problem with names like that. I think they're cool, actually. And, yes.
You're a small company and your target market is going to be very nervous about doing business with a two-person shop. How do you make yourself seem larger short of committing an act of fraud?
Yeah.
What are the things you can do to
Yeah.
make yourself seem
So do you pull partners in? Do you have a larger network? Because I don't do everything in my company either, but I have this sort of sea of people that I pull from, whether like for video production or for, you know, even analytics or things like that. So I can say we do that, but then I pull in these experts as needed. You know, I don't want to have them on the payroll all the time, so I want to be able to dip in and dip out. Any other questions? What's up? All right. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.